Good evening. I'm Jason Johnson in for Joy Reid. We begin the readout tonight with the danger that was averted when Joe Biden was sworn into office just this past January. Explosive new reporting has revealed that in the final months of the previous administration, there was genuine, 100% genuine concern inside our government that Donald Trump would stage a coup and stay in power. These were not the idle concerns or us chattering classes. They came from the highest levels in government, including from the country's top-ranking military officer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. That's according to excerpts from a new book set to release next week, I Alone Can Fix It, Donald J. Trump's Catastrophic Final Year, by Washington Post reporters Carol Lennick and Philip Rucker. They report that as Trump purged the ranks of the Pentagon and refused to concede the election, General Milley was actively working to avert a possible coup. He told his closest deputies, quote, they may try, but they're not going to blank and succeed. As early as November, he and the Joint Chiefs began informally planning how they could block a presidential order to use the military in a way they considered illegal or dangerous and ill-advised. And there were others who shared Milley's concern, too, a list that reportedly includes former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, although, unsurprisingly, he says it's totally not true. But Milley's most chilling assessment of the former president came as Trump mobilized his supporters behind the big lie, a mass delusion so powerful it inspired a terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol. Quote, Milley saw Trump as the classic authoritarian leader with nothing left to lose. He saw parallels between Trump's rhetoric of election fraud and Adolf Hitler's insistence to his followers at the Nuremberg rallies that he was both a victim and their savior. This is a Reichstag moment, Milley told aides, the gospel of the Fuhrer. Let that sink in for a second. That's how serious this was in January, that Donald Trump posed such a threat to this country at that particular moment that the top brass in the American military not only recognized, thankfully, but actually had to take steps to prevent a coup. Yet, despite the gravity of that news, the Republican Party continues to pledge loyalty to the former president and coup instigator. Just today, House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy paid a house call at Trump's Bedminster Club to bend the knee once again. Meanwhile, in his reaction to the story today, Trump himself seemed confused by the reporting. He said, if I was going to do a coup, one of the last people I would want to do it with is General Mark Milley. Of course, it's not really what the book says. Milley was intent on preventing a coup, not joining one. Speaking of joining me now is Congressman Eric Swalwell of California, author of Endgame, Inside the Impeachments of Donald J. Trump, and Miles Taylor, former Department of Homeland Security Chief of Staff and co-founder of the Renew America movement. I will begin with you, Congressman Swalwell. As a member of Congress, I don't think we can be reminded enough of how dangerous and how precipitous our potential loss of this country was back in January. With these new quotes coming out of this book, does this make you look any differently to that time? Are you even more frightened thinking about how close we were? Or is this just par for the course and you realize now, hey, look, I knew this was that dangerous 6 months ago. I'm glad now the rest of the public's picking it up.
Well, Jason, I would actually say it's not how close did we come. We actually crossed that Rubicon. And for the first time ever in our country's history, we did not have a peaceful transition of power. Look, I don't look at this book and say, these people who spoke up were heroes. Your other guest, Miles Taylor, he spoke up when it was at great political risk to do so. People like Alexander Vindman and Masha Yovanovitch and Fiona Hill, they spoke up to help stop the Ukrainians from putting dirt on Donald Trump's political opponent when Donald Trump was asking them to do this. This is coming out after the act. And I just happen to think that had these people spoken up before the January 6th insurrection, maybe Officer Sicknick would be alive today. Maybe hundreds of officers who were injured would not have been injured, and maybe we would have had a peaceful transition of power.
Mr. Taylor, this going along with what Congressman Swalwell just said, all of these people in this book now who are saying, oh, my gosh, this is so bad, it's so terrible. None of these people were willing to speak up. None of them said anything that mattered, right? They're all the person that comes to you after you've been dressed down by your boss and comes to your office afterwards like, oh, my gosh, that was so terrible. You didn't say anything during the staff meeting. So when you hear these people now revealing in a book how dangerous they thought things were, does it inspire you? Does it make you think, OK, cool, our system somewhat worked? Or does it remind you of what feckless cowards we had in our government who were only willing to do something and admit that they were doing something to keep us safe after the fact?
Yeah, Jason, look, by the end of the administration, Donald Trump got what he always wanted, which was a cabinet full of cowards. That's what he wanted,
Right.
a pliable cabinet. And the fact that these people didn't speak out was one of the greatest professional disappointments of my entire life. I came to Washington, D.C. as a young, idealistic page working on the House floor. Eric remembers where the page desk used to be. That same desk was used to blockade the chamber to keep insurrectionists from coming in. I was inspired to come work in Washington. I have seen my heroes all die moral deaths in this town because they lacked the courage to speak out. Behind the scenes, Jason, they would say, this man is a threat to the fabric of our republic. And then they didn't do anything. No one has to play the violin for me. But look, it cost me my job, my personal relationships, my home, my personal savings, and my security to speak out against the guy. Guess what? Damn it. I would do it again if we got the same result. And I wish more of those cabinet secretaries had done it. Now, I will say one thing about what General Milley said, and I hate to be the annoying guy who's going to say, well, if you read my book, I titled my book A Warning for a reason. It was a year before the election, and I said in that book, if Donald Trump if Donald Trump loses re-election, he will deny that he lost, and it will lead to violence. This was foreseeable, and it's not hyperbole to say this man implemented Nazi-like policies and had Nazi-like tendencies. We saw it up close. He was an authoritarian. He loved authoritarians. And in Oval Office meetings with me, he would talk about his magical powers like the Insurrection Act that he wanted to use to do extraordinary things. True story, Jason. He told us at one point he wanted to use the Insurrection Act to seal the U.S. southern border because it was a powerful tool. This was in his mind in year one of his administration. I have no doubt that he considered a coup.
You know, I'm glad that you mentioned this sort of idea of Nazis. In the book, Milley likens Trump to Hitler. He says that this is our clearest example of what this would look like. Congressman Swalwell, I'll tell you this little anecdote, and I want you to understand, I want your sort of perspective on this, of how dangerous Trump was. I spent time abroad right before the 2016 election in Germany, and I actually had members of the press there tell me that America was not taking the threat of Donald Trump that seriously. I remember actually saying to a reporter, I don't even know if this guy is going to win. They said, you sounded just like we did in 1933. When you hear these kinds of reports, when you hear Donald Trump being compared to Hitler, when you see what he was attempting to do at the border, are these hyperbolic comparisons at this point? Are we trying to demonize him in order to make America realize how dangerous it was? Or do you think that's a fair comparison now that we find out more and more about what he was attempting to do?
Jason, I'd actually fast forward and look at democracies that have died in the past decade, whether it's the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary, Hong Kong, and then, of course, Russia, continues to slide farther and farther into being an autocracy. We're not different in that could happen to us. And the thought I had on the House floor, Jason, that I'll never forget, the anger, the emotion that came over me as the banging and smashing of glass was taking place was, it can't end like this. Like, democracy cannot die like this. And we barely hung on. And I would offer that we're on life support right now. And what has really changed from January 6th? Republicans have not passed any security funding that would make us safer at the Capitol. Donald Trump is telling people he's coming back in August. And the leader of the Republican Party, Kevin McCarthy, is at Donald Trump's residence in New Jersey today. So nothing has really changed. We are on life support right now, and it's a fight every day to keep this democracy alive.
I want to ask this directly, Congressman Swalwell, and I think it's really important before we sort of close this segment here. Do you trust your Republican colleagues with this country anymore? I mean, do you actually trust them with this country?
No. I trust Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Mitt Romney. There's a few others in the Senate. But no, mostly no. I really fear that they are all in for this cult personality. And it's because they don't have the imagination, the creativity, or the courage to do the right thing to save this country.
I want to go to this last one. This is another really horrifying part here. Mr. Taylor, in the book, it's reported that apparently General Milley actually went to Speaker Pelosi and said, hey, look, we'll make sure that Trump doesn't use the nuclear codes. That was a part of a conversation he actually had. I have to ask you so that everybody is, again, aware of how dangerous things were for us at that time, politically and internationally. What do you think Trump was going to try to do if he had gotten access to, was he going to try and start a war with Iran or something else like that and extend his power? What on earth could the president have wanted to do with nuclear codes faced with the fact that he had been voted out by the American people?
Well, one can only imagine, Jason, but I've got to assume that in Donald Trump's mind, he believed there was a scenario where he could deploy the United States military in such a way to deny Joe Biden from taking office. That was the fear I had a year before the election. It was a fear I had in the days after the election. But I'm going to tell you this, Jason, I've spent my whole career not as a political operative. I've never worked on a campaign in my life other than campaigning against Trump. I'm a national security guy. I've worked in national security against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Russia. And the number one national security threat I've ever seen in my life to this country's democracy is the party that I'm in, the Republican Party. It is the number one national security threat to the United States of America. And I'll tell you this, if my party retakes the U.S. House of Representatives in the next cycle, it's going to become a haunted house. And the ghoul and the specter haunting that house is going to be Donald Trump. And if Kevin McCarthy's hand is on the speaker's gavel, it's really Donald Trump's hand on the speaker's gavel. And the fact that Kevin McCarthy continues to pay homage to a twice impeached presidential loser, I think should give all Americans pause and make them worry about the future of this country and its security.